Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today I'm finally talking about the new album from Oneohtrix Point Never, again! Okay, Oneohtrix Point Never, Daniel Lopatin. This is now my fourth time covering this legendary experimental artist on this channel. I've gone on multiple times about all the big game-changing releases he put out through the first half of the 2010s, such as Replica, R+7, and Garden of Delete, which were so out of the box at the time that they felt like they could be like brand new directions for what electronic music could even be. Though as the years went by, he kind of just settled into a specific sound and style for himself and finding new twists on the sounds we already knew from him. Age of in 2018 was the first step in that direction, a very strange album that combined a bunch of different sides to his sound on previous albums, with a few turns towards pop featuring his own vocals, as well as some prog-influenced material with a lot of harpsichords. It ended up not really coming together as a cohesive whole much at all, but there was definitely some fun to be had with how unpredictable and wildly varied and all over the place the experience could be. But then at the end of 2020 he delivered Magic Oneohtrix Point Never, which was his most normal sounding album in the better part of a decade, leaning even more on the poppier elements and his own heavily processed vocals, even bringing in The Weeknd to sing on one track as well as executive produce the whole thing. They'd become pretty close friends, and Lopatin would in turn later go on to co-produce the vast majority of The Weeknd's recent Dawn FM album. Magic Oneohtrix Point Never is an album that seems to be maybe a little divisive among the core fan base, since a lot of people were hoping for something that was a lot more out of the box than it actually turned out to be. I initially had that feeling myself when I first heard that album, but it eventually grew on me to become not just one of my favorite albums of 2020, but also just straight up one of my favorite albums he's ever made, full stop. No other album in his catalog ever made me think about Daniel Lopatin as a regular person than that one. Just some regular guy who lives in the ordinary human world with regular feelings and emotions we can all relate to, instead of some, like, untouchable sound wizard or something. Delivering what I feel to be easily his most personal and emotionally charged material yet, while still never sacrificing the weirder experimental flares to his sound that make him so easily recognizable. Now, going into a new album from him, I can't say I fully knew what to expect, given every new album of his is gonna be different in some way, but that last album was a clear demonstration of two facts. One, that OPN could still make something that could connect with me on that deeper level without having to, like, totally reinvent the wheel. And two, whatever he was going to deliver next, I was probably going to need to spend a lot of time with in order to fully process my thoughts. Hence why this video is taking so long. And honestly, it's a good thing I have spent as much time with this album as I have. It's kinda needed that in order for me to fully parse my feelings on it. There's a lot going on here. While Lopatin has advertised this album as a sort of reimagining of ideas his younger self came up with and made parallels to an old album of his like Garden of Delete, to me this feels more like an extension of ideas from his last two albums, and especially Age of. This feels like if that album actually came together as a complete whole and felt fully realized. But it also touches on new territory that those albums didn't fully explore either, mainly by this feeling like his most prog-rockish album yet. There's more guitars and stuff than last time, and there's 3 tracks that feature full live orchestral arrangements care of the Nomad Ensemble. Right from when this album first started with the less than 2-minute intro Elsewhere, I figured we are going to get something special. It's just a straight orchestral string piece, but it feels very warm and enveloping and has cool progressions from being sprightly and energetic to sad but also peaceful. A lot of satisfying ups and downs in those quick 2 minutes and pulls me in really effectively, still setting itself apart as a personal highlight in spite of its straightforwardness in comparison with everything else here. But from there, the album just keeps wandering into new sounds and consistently keeps you guessing where things might go next. Like, the title track hits you with all these chopped up vocal samples that remind me of the opening section of the Clark track Un-UK, as well as these wiry synths for extra texture that kinda call to mind some of the most intense moments of his debut album, Betrayed in the Octagon, but also taking digressions into strange warbling bass, sparse glitches and scratches, as well as some light pianos and strings for accompaniment. Just a lot of sounds cascading around and building up into this wild and kaleidoscopic and colorful mix that just seems to unpredictably float around every which way and still come out pretty satisfying. Now, this is the kind of thing I specifically come to Oneohtrix Point Never for. And I don't think I'd even mark that track as one of my bigger favorites here. But then the album takes another turn for some, pop songs, or rather tracks that structure themselves like pop songs and feature Lopatin's own processed vocal performances, although as you'd expect are made up out of a lot of strange and experimental ideas. World Outside definitely delivers a lot more of those Garden of Delete vibes, switching off between all these blasts of melodic noise that sound like rewinding tapes, with crashing and slamming 80s beatwork going up next to synth choirs and some violins, acting like build-ups and drops or verses and choruses. Also, Lopatin sounds like he's getting a lot more confident and comfortable with his vocals with the few tunes and interjections he provides. And there's also a cool little solo guitar outro tacked on at the end. Krumville is another pretty fun and interesting moment that goes for something a bit more peaceful. That title may not be particularly evocative or confidence-inspiring, but there's a lot of nice, warm loops of guitars and weird, repeating, blubbering vocal processing, creating a pretty warm and friendly subspace, perhaps getting sidetracked into ambient synths and more brittle 80s guitars, but it does build into a lot more of an actual song featuring vocals from Shushu of all people, and the guitar is getting a lot crunchier and more visceral, getting a lot of old classic rock or even very slight country vibes in a bunch of moments here, at least before everything melts into a formless ambient blur by the end. Meanwhile, you also got a track like Locrian Midwest, which features all these weird harpsichord manipulations that bring certain moments of Age of to mind, as well as lots of off-the-wall stretched-out samples, but it also brings in a lot of warmer pianos and a few cellos to ground the track and provide it with a more pleasant emotional connection, eventually transitioning pretty directly into following track Plastic Antique, that features all these rapidly blipping but slowly marching synth textures that bounce along, build up and down, and get joined by other warm soundscape building in the background, as well as eventually building up into another really heavy and visceral industrial beat for all of 20 seconds, before sidetracking into lots of formless but well-layered peaceful ambience that just wanders around for the entire second half of the track and keeps shifting its shape and texture in cool ways. Next we got Gray's Subviolet, which is the second proper orchestral piece. A lot of fluttering and evocative strings joining Lopatin's typically plastic synth harpsichord plucking and some harsh glitching way in the background. There's a really epic and chaotic build-up to the string arrangements on this one that kind of reminds me a little of that one part of the Beatles' Day in the Life, albeit with more of an actual melodic direction. And then we hit the body trail, which I thought was another really cool idea. There's all this tense ambience and all these different spoken snippets going up next to piano and string performances. Sometimes the strings kind of imitate the tone of the voices in those snippets, like what Steve Reich did on Different Trains. And sometimes the snippets are processed in autotune in a cool way and go up next to layers of bright melodic synths that kind of imitate the strings or the snippets, and the whole mix always feels really big and imposing and on the verge of exploding without ever actually doing so, in a way that still feels satisfying. Really keeps me on the edge of my seat. Nightmare Paint, meanwhile, does sort of try to have more of an actual tune at first in its humming synths and pianos and light marching beats that also have all these harsh glitch effects coming to cut through the entire mix, next to barely audible opera samples. There's more warm ambience with a bunch of different flavors of 80s guitar noodling, as well as some big heavy beats building up like a weirder and more abstract take on the track Lost But Never Alone from his last album. And the track keeps floating back and forth between trying to structure itself with the guitar tunes and falling into formless noise blurs. And that leads directly into Memories of Music, which kind of just carries right from where that track leaves off, albeit structuring it over a mostly steady set of slowly plodding drumming. Starting out with kind of a nice laid-back mix of guitars and warm melodic synths, as well as a few wiry textures squeaking away. Some old-school 70s Hammond organs are introduced, with a bunch of fluttering flute melodies in the background, returning to the laid-back guitar and synth progressions that switch off between feeling thin and barely present to warm and enveloping and even new age-ish, to a lot of distorted blaring later on, to sounding like 70s Berlin School arrangements at one point. All adding up to another one of the more Garden of Delete-ish tracks on display here. On an Axis is another odd moment for the album. The entire first half is taken up by a lot of stretched out samples, all adding up to that classic vaporwave style from over a decade ago. Mostly not that satisfying, but then it switches into another rollicking guitar-driven mix with heavy 80s beats in the second half and building up in a cool way, as a number of other tracks here have done, but this time with more of a proper drop at the end. And then there's Ubiquity Road, which returns us into a lot of very warm and sentimental 70s synth ambience, staying very low-key aside from one quick moment around the halfway mark with all these harsh synth choirs, after which a lot more flutes and woodwinds are introduced in the mix alongside of bleepy synth arpeggios later. makes for a welcome, easily accessible, emotional breather in what has been a particularly chaotic listen so far, and still manages to hit some transcendental heights in the middle of its thicker Blade Runner pads later on. And that finally takes us to the closer and lead single from this thing, A Barely Lit Path. The grand culmination that all the weird ideas this album explored has been leading up to. The intro of this track features Lopatin's vocals filtered through some Imogen Heap-type vocoders that are heavily glitched up, going over more 70s Hammond organs, all carrying that deeper emotion pretty effectively, winding into a whole section of all these chopped-up filtered synths, and then one last full-string orchestra arrangement, which is possibly the prettiest of all the symphonic moments that have appeared thus far. Also adding what sounds like synth-modulated children's choirs on top, a lot of woodwinds later, and dramatic synth organ progressions that bring R+7's opener to mind. And it just keeps building up more and more and getting more and more epic and dense and cluttered with so much aggressive noise, before finally slowly winding down for the much more tender and low-key final moments of layered synth excursions to close everything out. Damn, now that's how you close an album. That's probably my favorite track here. I don't know if it's what I would have picked as a pre-album teaser single. I directly avoided listening to it before hearing the album in full since I didn't want the big grand ending spoiled to me. It feels like I made the right call there, though I'm not sure what I would have picked if I'd been asked to point to a single. Maybe World Outside or Nightmare Pain or something, I don't know. But yeah, that's everything on Again. As you can tell, this album is a lot to take in, and I will say that at no point during all my listens of this album was I feeling like we were hitting the kind of deeper and more personal emotional heights that his last album could deliver. But this also feels like it could possibly be a bounce back for the people who maybe weren't as keen on that project. If you've been hungering for that more experimental and mind-bending side to his sound, this is a lot more mind-bending than his previous two albums. The ideas that go into this album may mostly be ones that I've heard him explore before, but they're presented in a new way that makes them feel novel and allows this album to stand apart as its own thing in the greater context of his catalog, especially thanks to all the symphonic elements, which aren't something I've heard him work with before. Surprisingly good year for electronic and orchestral crossovers this has been. And unlike Age of, which presented a lot of similar ideas in a much messier and more disjointed fashion, Again actually gets these ideas to flow well together and feel a lot more like a greater cohesive whole. All these tracks feel like they musically segue into each other to add up to a more unified overarching album experience. Which maybe could also be a double-edged sword for others. The tighter flow does make this album run together more than a lot of his other stuff and make it more difficult to tell tracks apart from each other or where any number of them begin or end. But I also enjoy all 13 tracks on this thing on a roughly equal level. There's not a super pronounced distance between how much I could get out of one of the lower points like On an Axis or one of the higher points like A Barely Lit Path. And every track still feels like it has its own defined identity anyway, so instead of making the album feel sameier than it needed to, the flow makes this album feel more like a slowly unfolding puzzle box that gets you more reward the closer you pay attention to it and are able to notice all the dense layers of greater nuance that go into each track the more time you spend with it. I may not like it as much as his last album, but with how massively dense and expectedly out of the box the sound design and presentation of this whole thing was, and how many new details I would keep picking up on with every passing listen over this past month or whatever, I definitely would not be surprised if this ends up sitting alongside some of my favorite projects of 2023 overall. It's like an honorable mention on my year-end list at the very least, and I'm overall feeling an 8.3 out of 10 on it. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. There are some people you want to add yourself that list. Link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.